Hello, everyone. Hi from Chicago, Illinois, where it is the evening of the night before. Um, as just introduced, this is lessons learned from deploying OneDrive Sync. Let's start by I'll introduce myself more completely. I'm Michael Bluementhal. I'm an MVP, and I've got OneDrive on my mind. I've been working with OneDrive Sync, deploying it to a large organization of about 50,000 users, a large multinational corporation, for the last 12 and a half months. My manager came to me, actually, my manager's manager came to me at the end of June of last year and said, we want to deploy this and let's get to it. And so we started this year-long saga. And right now, as we speak, for the last 2 weeks and for the next several weeks, we're deploying at least 1,000 users a day are receiving the Sync client. To get there has been quite a journey, and it takes really quite a team when you're doing it at this scale. It's been a project team of around 10 to 12 people on a regular basis. We've had a project manager, a change manager responsible for organizational change management and communications, a deployment manager in charge of deployment logistics and coordinating with regional deployment leads, because there's a regional deployment lead for every country that the company does business in. There's a data analyst responsible for some of the data management related to deployment. There was our group policy expert who managed one of the people in the team of people that manages group policy for the organization, as well as people from our SCCM, that System Center Configuration Manager team. That's the SCCM is the product used, the Microsoft product used to deploy applications to end user desktops. We also worked with an engineer from Microsoft's Fast Track offering. We had some engagement from our networking team to make sure that all the sync traffic, we understood how that was impacting the network and made sure it wasn't impacting it unduly. Working with our support team to make sure they had the knowledge articles needed to support when people were submitting support tickets for OneDrive issues. Working with our Citrix team, because we wanted to have OneDrive in Citrix environments, working with our Jamf administrator for deploying OneDrive Sync client to Macintoshes as well, to Macs. So again, it took quite a big team to do this. And what I'm going through here now is all the things that I've learned and want to share with you as part of this project, so that you too can go and deploy OneDrive Sync and get the benefits of it. So let's start from the basics. What is OneDrive? OneDrive is a place for your stuff. And by that, I mean a place to store your personal work files. And of course, I'm talking about OneDrive for Business, not OneDrive, the consumer offering. The other question that usually comes up in terms of what is OneDrive is, how is OneDrive different from SharePoint? And the way I position OneDrive versus SharePoint is to say that SharePoint is for files for teams, projects, or departments, and OneDrive is for your personal work files. Now, of course, there is some overlap between the two where you can share files and collaborate on files in your OneDrive with other people in your organization, but you do that more on an ad hoc basis versus SharePoint sites are for existing planned structured groups. So a quick phrase you can use to remember or to help users understand where they should put what. OneDrive is for me, SharePoint is for we. Now that's OneDrive, the cloud storage. The next question is, what is OneDrive Sync? OneDrive Sync is a desktop application that synchronizes files between the SharePoint or OneDrive online storage and the user's machine. So there's really 4 scenarios that are supported. There is the OneDrive, the corporate OneDrive. So each user gets a OneDrive, and the cloud storage for that then is synced to a folder in their user profile directory. So on their C drive, in the user's folder, under their username, you'll see when you install OneDrive, a folder appear where it's just named OneDrive dash and then whatever the company name is, which is really the name of the Office 365 tenancy that was assigned when it was set up. So could be OneDrive dash Contoso, whatever the company name is usually what the tenant name is. You can also use the same application to synchronize the OneDrive, the consumer offering. And if you do choose to do that or allow that, then that will sync to a folder simply called OneDrive, again, in the user profile folder. The third scenario is syncing a user's SharePoint or SharePoint libraries of the user's choice, again, to a folder in their user profile folder. So instead of OneDrive dash company name, it'll just be company name, and then every library will have a folder underneath that from SharePoint. Now, of course, it's also possible for a user to sync SharePoint libraries from other tenancies. And in that case, those will show up in folders based on the tenant name or the company name. Let me just rearrange some windows here. Okay. So that is what sync does. Let's look at that from the desktop experience as well. So in Windows 10, what you'll see is in the left-hand navigation, you'll see these new set of icons show up in the left navigation. You'll see this office building icon for each SharePoint tenancy that's being synced, and you'll see the OneDrive Cloud for the OneDrive for Business, or if you do allow OneDrive Consumer, you'll see that labeled as OneDrive-Personal. If you're running Windows 10 build 1803, or rather version 1803 or later, then you'll have the status column. Versions of Windows 10 before 1803 and Windows 7 will not have the status column. In the system tray, you'll see the little blue cloud, and if it's actively syncing, you'll see the little white circle with the blue arrows. So that's the end user experience. The next thing you need to understand is licensing. Office 365 licensing, the most common flavors used in enterprises are E1, E3 and E5, and F3, formerly called F1. The E1 license, the amount of OneDrive cloud storage provisioned is 1 terabyte. For E3 and E5, it's 1 terabyte, but you can get more if you need to, and you can go up to 25 terabytes. And if you need to go beyond 25 terabytes, they'll basically allocate you another SharePoint site collection. And of course, you have the rights to sync as part of your license. So the OneDrive Sync Client licensing is it's included in your Office 365 licensing. Now for F3 licenses, it's a little bit different. When I originally wrote the slide deck, the Microsoft documentation online said that the F3 licenses were not entitled to sync. And I presented that and then reviewed it with the product team, and it turns out that they don't actually enforce that, and they would encourage you. F3 users certainly can sync. There's nothing in the code that will do the license check for that. However, F3 is the kiosk or deskless user SKU. So it's intended for someone who doesn't actually have a desktop. And the sync experience is only a desktop experience. So if you are in a scenario where your F3 user has a desktop, they can sync. They'll only get 2 gigs of cloud storage to use. If they're actually a truly deskless worker, then they won't have a device that is capable of syncing. The mobile experience, the web experience are not sync experiences. The other weird thing about licensing is that if you look at the applications that you can assign as part of your Office license, there is no OneDrive application listing. OneDrive licensing is controlled, or application assignment is actually the SharePoint Online Plan 2 application assignment. What that means is that if you want someone to have a OneDrive site provisioned for them, they have to have the SharePoint Online Plan 2 license. And then strangely enough, SharePoint Online doesn't actually check if the user has the license assigned in most cases. So what we did in our organization for a while was we actually had all our users not have the SharePoint Online Plan 2 license until we rolled out OneDrive to them. And as part of the deployment process, we would turn on that license or application assignment. Was a complicating factor there I'll cover later on, about which is why we had to turn that on for everyone before we did the deployment, but I'll save that story for later. So that's licensing. The next thing is the first run experience. Deploying OneDrive Sync is much more than just putting an application on the user's desktop. You've got to get them to log in. Once they log in, that's when the license check happens. Make sure that they have a OneDrive site provisioned for them, and that they have an office license assigned that includes the OneDrive application, or the SharePoint application, really, as I just explained. So there's that login and license check for the very first time, and then there's a tutorial. And you can suppress that tutorial through group policy, but I recommend you do not suppress it. That is the critical education of what OneDrive does, how it works, and how it's going to help users that people need to see. It's only 4 screens or so. So it's a very simple, easy to understand education. And you want this process to be interactive, so they go through that tutorial. The next piece is KFM. And KFM runs after the tutorial is complete. So the next question then is, what is KFM? Well, KFM is known folder move. Known folders are those Windows special folders that are given, that are featured in the left navigation of in File Explorer. So the ones that you're familiar with, desktop, documents, and pictures, those are all Windows known folders. There's some other known folders too, but only desktop, documents, and pictures are featured in known folder move. That is, OneDrive only moves desktop, documents, and pictures. And this feature is also called PC folder backup. And we'll talk about why that is in a few minutes here. But it's not all known folders, it's only those 3. So special folders like the 3D objects folder, the downloads folder, the music folder, videos, and favorites, those are not moved as part of OneDrive KFM, and OneDrive cannot move those. These special folders, if you click on My Computer in the File Explorer, these are the folders that are featured. Now, downloads, that stuff those files are files you got off the internet, so you can always download them again. So that's why Microsoft has judged that this doesn't make sense to protect the downloads folder. It doesn't make sense to sync those, because you can just get them again. Favorites, likewise, Microsoft does not plan to sync those ever, because the modern browsers all have ways to sync their favorites. Now, music and videos, those you may have business cases in marketing for why someone might want to have work files that are music or videos, for example. And there are things you can do with group policy to force music and videos to land in the OneDrive, the OneDrive company name folder. However, that uses a technique called folder redirection, and the folder redirection is a bit of a finicky beast as group policies go, because those run during login. And if you're not on the company network, either physically or via VPN during login, folder redirection policies will not work. And now, in the time of COVID, where everyone's working from home, folder redirection policies can't be applied unless your VPN solution starts before the user logs in. So enough said about that. So as I said, known folder move is a way of protecting desktop documents and pictures. Let's look at how it does that. So desktop documents and pictures are, by default, sit in the user's profile directory. So see users, whatever the username is, desktop documents and pictures. Known folder move moves those into the OneDrive company name folder. So one of the interesting side effects of this is In Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, in the File Open dialog where you have the list of recently used files, those links don't get updated when this move happens, and so those links can get broken. And the workaround is simply go navigate back to desktop documents and pictures because the shortcuts to those have been updated, and reopen the file. There's another thing to know about Known Folder Move and how it handles OneNote notebooks. So what many people aren't aware of is that the OneNote file format is different on the web than it is on the desktop. So OneNote notebooks stored in OneDrive or SharePoint use a different file structure than the notebooks that were created on your local machine. And there are two flavors of OneNote for Windows 10. There's OneNote from the Windows 10 Store, App Store, and there's the one that ships as part of Office. And the one that ships as part of Office lets you create local OneNote files. The one that is part of Windows 10 doesn't, insist you store them in a network location or SharePoint or OneDrive. I think perhaps only SharePoint and OneDrive. So when Known Folder Move runs and you move your documents folder into OneDrive-company name, and then those files start syncing, that initial sync, that initial upload of all your files to your OneDrive, the process for OneNote is special. It has to convert the OneNote files on the fly. And so what it does is it uploads it, it converts it, and then removes it from the user desktop and replaces it with a shortcut. So there's no longer a .one file or whatever and the other related file extensions and file structure on your local machine. All of that is removed and you're left with a shortcut. That can be alarming to some users, but again, if they simply follow open the shortcut, it'll open OneNote on the web, and whether that file is stored in OneDrive, which in this case is where it was moved to, same thing is true for SharePoint though. It'll open the shortcut, the OneNote on the web will open, and then you can open in desktop, and now the desktop one will reopen the notebook, syncing it from OneDrive. Now, this feature didn't arrive until OneDrive Sync version 19.202 or later. And so we had to wait until 19.222 was the enterprise release for us to be able to do this. Before that feature was out, and again, we were trying to do this at the end of last year, 6 months ago, and this feature was being released just in December. So that was an issue for us, but now this feature has been incorporated for the last 6 months, and so it's no longer a blocker, and hasn't been since, again, December. When we were first doing our deployments back in November, people with OneNote notebooks in My Documents had to manually move them, and that was a multi-step process. Moving on to update channels. The OneDrive Sync client can automatically update, and it's a very fast update. But you get to pick, as administrator, what the update frequency is. So there's 3 release channels or rings. There's the insider ring, where Microsoft releases a new version of OneDrive pretty much every 3 days. For the production ring, which goes to the vast majority of people, inside and outside organizations, they release updates every 2 weeks. Then the enterprise ring, if you choose to use it, is every 2 months, approximately. Now, there's another twist to that, where just because you're running a particular version of the sync client doesn't mean that the behavior of the sync client can't change at all. There are certain features and behaviors of the sync client that Microsoft has ways of controlling on the back end. An example of this is the graphics used in the tutorial. We were doing some documentation of the tutorial for our end user documentation, and to show what the first run experience looks like. And we noticed that between one day and another, the graphics changed. Our version of OneDrive didn't change, but they changed the graphics on the back end. And so we had to redo our documentation. So the next thing to understand is how you check what version of OneDrive you're running. So in the system tray, you've got the blue cloud icon. You right-click on that. You get your settings. You get that menu, pick settings, and it opens up a dialog box, and you go to the About tab. And then you see the version number, but it's not just the version number, it's a hyperlink. If you click that, you get taken to the web page, and as an administrator, this web page is extremely helpful. And so if you're doing a deployment of OneDrive, plan to be checking this web page probably once a week. This has the latest generally available production ring version of OneDrive for download, but it also shows you the versions that are in the different rings. And you'll notice that the Insider's ring, you can't directly download that. You have to tell your sync app to use the Insider ring, which you can do through policy. The production ring, so this is one that's currently out there, and it is a link, so you can directly download that and install it on a machine if you need to. The other thing to point out, as I should point out, is that installation of the OneDrive Sync client does not require admin permission. So even if you have admin rights locked down on an end user machine, they can still install this. The fact that it doesn't require admin permission also made the SCCM package a little bit interesting. And so if you're going to package it in SCCM, that's something your SCCM experts will work through. But again, back to the version numbers, you can see this is the version that's currently deployed to everybody, and they've started rolling out the next release. So 20.084 is being replaced by 21.14. Enterprise, the current release is 20.052. This was released on July 6th, so just earlier this month, which means that the next release probably won't happen till late August, early September, but they've already said that the next release is going to be something in the 20.114 family. And you notice they don't see the minor version numbers because they can still update the minor version numbers. So major version numbers is a fixed feature set. Minor version numbers are security patches. So if they find anything wrong with 20.114 for the month or 2 months that it's in production before coming to enterprise, they will release an updated version for it. So the minor version number that is released to enterprise could be a little different than what's in production today. Now let's change gears a bit and ask ourselves, what is success? So success for OneDrive Sync deployment is not just about landing the bits. It's not about, oh, I installed the client on the desktop and I'm done. It's really about getting the user to log in to OneDrive and going through the first run experience, and then triggering known folder. I should not say triggering, because through group policy, we triggered known folder move to happen at the end of setup. And so there's a couple kinds of success. One is having known folder move run to completion. And the reason that is so important is that that means that everything in desktop, documents, and pictures is now syncing to the cloud and therefore backed up. What that means is that the laptop is essentially now disposable, assuming that the user, of course, is only storing things in synced folders. But if they are, then should the laptop be lost or stolen or damaged, no big deal. You get them a new laptop, they log into OneDrive, everything syncs back down, they're back to where they left off, and they're good to go. It's no longer a days to rebuild a laptop and reinstall everything, and if they only had files on their machine, they've lost those. There's hours and hours of work to recreate. No, if everything's syncing, then a laptop lost, damaged, or stolen, no big deal. Give them a new one, they log in, they're up and running again. So from the IT pro side, it's getting KFM up and running. From the user experience side, it's users have to understand the value of storing things in syncing folders and then religiously do so. And then the next behavior change that we want from people is for people to share links rather than sending attachments. So if you think about what that behavior change is about, it's about when I have a document that I need to send out for review, and historically I would send that attachment as an email, and I would send it to 5 people. Each person would get a separate version. They'd make changes, send it back to me, and I have to waste a lot of time integrating changes. By sending a link to the document, that document lives in one place, whether that's OneDrive or SharePoint, and then everybody who you want to change the document changes the single master copy, the single source of truth. When they do that, you can always go to follow that link to see the latest changes to the document. You can see who's made changes, who got version history, and you don't have to spend that time integrating everybody's changes. So that's a huge time savings and a huge productivity win. So how do we measure usage of OneDrive? In the Office 365 Administrative Console in admin.microsoft.com, there are a number of reports. You can see the number of people actively syncing on a daily basis. You can see the number of people who have viewed or edited documents in OneDrive, how many people have synced, how many people have shared documents internally versus externally. If you turn off external sharing for OneDrive, and some organizations do, such as ours, our sharing policy is only allowing people who want to share externally must use certain SharePoint sites that have been set up for external sharing. OneDrive sharing is for internal use only. Most SharePoint sites are for internal use only. That's our governance policy. So there are these reports in the Office 365 Admin Center, and they give you some idea of activity, but they really don't help you with your sync success. So they don't tell you enough about, was KFM successful on a user's machine? Were there any sync problems? Are any of your users having any sync problems? Those reports are coming soon. The product team for OneDrive has been working on those for a while. They have been tempting us with, they're supposed to come to private preview later this month or next month. And we're already in velocity deployments now. So the sooner we get our hands on those, the better it is. But what we've had to do, because we don't have those, is use other tools to report on the registry changes that happen when KFM is successful. I should also mention another indicator of successful deployment and simple adoption is, as people store more things in OneDrive and sync them, you'll see your OneDrive storage shoot up, and that's what we've seen. We've went from, I think it was 9 terabytes of OneDrive storage to now we're at about 40 terabytes of OneDrive storage. Now, again, every user gets a terabyte, so we could go up to 50,000 terabytes since we have 50,000 users. So we have a lot of capacity, but also a significant usage. Now I'm going to do a bit of a retrospective of what makes this hard, and sort of all the different little and not so little hurdles we faced to get to this point. There were regulatory approvals and data residency concerns. Of all the countries in the world, Germany has a workers' council, and at least for us, they have a special process we have to go through to get new applications approved by the workers' council in order for it to deploy there. And that can take a very long time. China has different data residency data residency requirements, where in order to comply with their data residency requirements, we would have to stand up a separate Office 365 tenancy, not a geo, which is a OneDrive storage that's part of our tenant, but a whole separate tenant, which is a whole separate management overhead. And that tenant has to be provided by 21 VNet and all data and everything lives in China. So we don't have the staff to take on managing a whole separate tenant and the overhead of that. So we're not deploying OneDrive to China. Also, there's no Android mobile app for OneDrive in China. When we got started, there were firewall issues. There were ports that were closed and need to be opened. Some of the things that didn't work when the firewall was closed was that the backup tab didn't show up in the settings dialog, and automatic updates couldn't work. I already told you about the first run experience, the tutorial changing while we tried to document it, because Microsoft was changing things on the back end, even though we had one particular version of the OneDrive sync client we were working with. Even though the bits on the machine weren't changing, the behavior was because of backend changes. When we first started deployment, we ran the OneNote issues because we started before release 19.202, which didn't have the support for automatic upgrade and upload of OneNote notebooks. Existing group policies, especially the folder redirection policies, where there were where all the folders that people thought would be a good idea to force into OneDrive, there were group policies for those, and those conflicted with known folder move. We had to support 3 different operating systems: Windows 7, Windows 10 1703, and Windows 10 1803. And only 1803 of the 3 of those supported files on demand. And I believe that started with Windows 10 1709, I think, is when it was first supported files on demand. There are a lot of existing installs of the sync client, all different versions. When we did an inventory report through SCCM, we saw versions starting with 17. 18. 19. All sorts of random versions installed, but no one ever logged in, so there was no auto upgrade triggered. There was also the installer for OneDrive on some machines, which isn't the same as having OneDrive installed. So there's OneDrive setup.exe present on a lot of machines, but it had never been run either. We had existing legacy users, and what I mean by that is that our environment had come over from Office 365 dedicated, where what we call OneDrive now originally had been SharePoint Server My Sites, and so the My Sites came over and basically became OneDrive sites with some quirks there. I mentioned at the beginning that you can control access to who can sync based on the SharePoint Online Plan 2 app assignment. Well, we had another project, a deployment of WebEx Teams, where there was integration with SharePoint Online, and so that forced us to deploy the SharePoint Online app assignment to everyone first, and so we could no longer use that to control who had the rights to use OneDrive. We spent a lot of time working out a retention policy. Eventually, the retention policy we landed on was 10 years from last modified, things would be automatically deleted. And that's to limit the e-discovery risk. Employee lifecycle, that's another important thing to understand, that taking away the OneDrive license doesn't deprovision the OneDrive. The OneDrives don't get deprovisioned until the user account is no longer in Azure Active Directory, and then by default it's 30 days after that the SharePoint user profile and the OneDrive go away. Actually, let me rephrase that. So 30 days after the account is deleted from Azure Active Directory, that's when the OneDrive goes away. I believe the SharePoint user profile goes away at the beginning of that time. but it's the OneDrive doesn't get deprovisioned until the end of 30 days, and that's configurable. One of the deployment logistics challenges was user to machine mapping. We could get an inventory of all the machines in the environment, but knowing who the users were of those machines and figuring out which machine was the user's primary machine if they had multiple machines, figuring out when who was getting what, because our communications about what we were doing had to go to people, but the sync client went to a machine. I already talked about reporting on deployment success, where we needed to use a third-party tool, in this case, something called Tanium. And let me go here. Something called Tanium, where it's a tool that can report back to us on registry settings, since there's a particular registry setting on a user's machine that gets set when KFM, when known folder move completes. Okay, next. Another thing we ran into was that the installation package did not prompt the user, or did not prompt the user enough. So depending on how the SCCM installation package was set up, the user wouldn't see the OneDrive prompting them to sign in. They would have to start OneDrive and then get prompted. Or as we later rebuilt the package, it would prompt them, and we got to the point where we had a package that would actually remind them every 15 minutes or so after install, please sign in if they hadn't signed in. Because what we found is people could just dismiss that, and if we didn't watch for that, then they could dismiss the installer, and they would never sign in. On the other hand, we had users who were surprised by known folder move happening, and whether there was the miscommunication or the fact that they already had their license and had been running OneDrive in the past, and then it picked up the group policy, and known folder moves ran, because if you're an existing user and the group policy comes down, it'll do it then, not just at launch, not just at installation. So that surprised a few users. We had a policy document that we had to modify to reflect that OneDrive cloud storage was an appropriate place to put certain kinds of work documents, and not an appropriate place for other kinds of work documents. In our deployment process, we gave users fair warning about what should and shouldn't be stored in OneDrive, and gave them time to do file cleanup. And so that lengthened the deployment time for any given user. It was, okay, we're going to tell them on this day and then deploy on several days later. A number of users, OneDrives that came over from SharePoint Dedicated had a folder in them called Shared with Everyone. And this created a lot of confusion. This is a folder that Microsoft had provisioned originally in SharePoint My Sites for a while, and then they decided to stop doing it because, again, it was more confusing than helpful. It was basically a folder that was permissioned, so anything you put in it, anyone in the organization could see. And they stopped doing that and defaulted everything in OneDrive to be private unless you share it. However, people with OneDrives that had come over from the old SharePoint environments still had these, and so we had to explain to people what they were. And often, if they were empty, we simply told people to delete them. I already talked about folder redirection, how folder redirection policies can block known folder move from working. Sometimes we would get known folder move failing, or OneDrive's installation or initial sync failing with odd numeric error messages. We came to incorporate those into our help documentation, our support resources, and learned what some of these meant. One was a user had more than one OneDrive on the back end for some reason. We'd have to open a ticket with Microsoft to get that cleaned up. One of the things that kept us from deploying in December was change freezes. We had policies in place where certain parts of the organization did not want any desktop changes during critical parts of their fiscal year. Another thing that made this project challenging was that when COVID started and the whole country went into lockdown, in fact, the whole planet went into lockdown, everybody started working from home. We now had to make sure that people were on VPN before we could deploy to them. There were some fiscal protection things done, which involved furloughing all contractors to save money to help deal with the uncertainty that COVID was presenting. And so we actually had much of our project team change over from contractors to internal resources several months ago. But nonetheless, we actually, because OneDrive was seen as a tool to improve the work from home experience, it actually was something that was encouraged for the project to push forward during COVID time to deliver a better colleague experience. So to wrap up, there's just a few resources I want to share with you. There's a podcast that the OneDrive Sync product team puts out, or a member of the product team puts out, called the Sync Up Podcast. The support hub for OneDrive is support.office.com/ENUS, or whatever language code you choose, OneDrive. And then there's the documentation hub, which includes all the coverage of group policies, which is docs.microsoft.com. And again, if you're going to do a global deployment or a company-wide deployment of Fast Track, if you have more than, I think it's 50 seats of licenses, you're eligible for Fast Track support. I would strongly encourage you to reach out to your Fast Track manager and avail yourself of the expertise of Fast Track engineer. So at this point, I will open this up to questions, and please put them in the chat, and I will answer them. I also want to point out that although the time zone difference might be challenging, we are doing one of the user communities I'm involved with in Chicago. We're doing a M365 virtual event in November 13th, and certainly if the time zones overlap, you're welcome to. And yes, I see some questions coming in. I also want to point out we have a YouTube channel for the user group that I run, and we've got a lot of videos there from previous meetings. Let me answer some of these questions. Okay. And someone put the link to the podcast in the chat. Thank you, Andrew. And Damien asks, do you have to deal with Mac deployments? Yes, we did. So that's what I was working with the Jamf engineer. So our Jamf administrator had to package up the OneDrive client and publish it out so that Mac users could get it. Files on demand is supported in Mac. There is no concept of known folder move. So that whole concept of forcing sync of particular popular folders to protect them doesn't exist on the Mac. So the alternative to that is just user training and encouraging people to learn to love synced folders. And is SharePoint Sync going to be made easier via GPO, Intune, MDM policies? So there is a pretty rich set of group policies for controlling the sync behavior, and then Intune. We didn't actually do much with Intune because of our mobile policy at the time was actually to have very limited mobile access and not provide access to SharePoint or OneDrive on mobile devices for security reasons. That's changing now, and if you ask me in a couple months, I'm sure I'll know more about Intune MDM policies. Yes. Did we ever encounter user files with unsupported characters? Files and file names. Yes, there is a small number of characters that are not allowed in OneDrive and SharePoint file names, because those file names are not URL friendly, or those characters would not make for URL friendly file names. And so in those cases, the sync client flags those and the user has to rename them. And that was part of the getting started documentation, and the cleanup time that we provided was to let people know that they would have to fix files with those names. Is KFM enabled by default now? So when you say now, I'm going to be very specific about that. So we're running 20.052, which is the latest enterprise release, and KFM is not on by default. We have a group policy that forces it on, and so that's what I'm working currently. But if you look at the release notes on that page, let's see if I've got. If you look at the release notes on this page, you'll see that that you should test that to see, because they are doing some changes to KFM policies. So it says admins can now enforce KFM policies. It sounds like I need to switch headsets.
I was trying to come up with something entertaining to say to fill in the blank here.
Can you still hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. That's a little bit clearer.
Okay.
Thanks.
Let me get back to the chat and keep answering these questions. Okay. Yes. We definitely had some users who had long folder paths, especially there's people who have deep hierarchies of folders and are not developers, and there's people who are developers and have deep file paths. And the reason why I make a distinction between the two of them is that developers, if they have like a code repository, those things are relatively easy to move out into a different location. Don't put your GitHub repo in documents. Move it to someplace else on your C drive so it's not in your OneDrive -company name folder. But if it's not a code repository, so it isn't structured in, yes, it's deep, but it's sort of one big thing you can move. If you have to, if it's just a really deep folder hierarchy, then yeah, that can be a lot of work to restructure it in a way that's going to be shallow enough. And again, that's why we provide people some warning and some time to clean up. Yep, and I'm echoing Andrew Young's comment there about folder redirection. Yes, unraveling deep folders can definitely be painful. Let me see. So again, folder redirection policies, if you're not on the corporate network, your VPN client, if your VPN client doesn't start before you log in, then you won't be able to change your folder redirection policies. And we had a folder redirection policy where a certain group of users, their My Documents directory was redirected to a network share. And so the process for converting that over to OneDrive was pretty ugly, where you would first have to get them to, you'd have to create a policy that turned off the folder redirection. And then when you're creating the policy, you have to decide the content that was in the redirected destination, are you going to bring that back down to, back to where where the default location is? So if they have a My Documents folder on their network drive and Documents is being redirected to that folder, depending on how you undo the policy, you need to choose whether all those files come back down to the user machine or not. And if people have a lot of files there and you choose to bring them back down, it happens during login. So when they get that policy to move things back to Documents and User Profile, all that file move happens during the login. It seems like it takes forever to log in. It's suddenly this really long login process that the user probably wasn't expecting. So that is ugly. Or you choose not to move those folders, and now the Documents appears empty, even though where it was in the old place is still there. Just now it's back in my profile, or user profile, and it's empty. So that's not great either. And then but once it's back in user profile, then OneDrive KFM can move it to into one level down into the OneDrive dash company name folder. Next question. Place any restrictions on syncing SharePoint sites to limit the amount of data stored on the PC laptop. So if they have files on demand, Windows 10 is pretty smart about how much stuff can be brought down. But if they don't have files on demand, then yes, you can sync so much stuff that you run them out of disk space. And there are some group policies that limit how much stuff can sync into, and in particular, you can set a threshold so that during that initial setup, they get prompted to pick what folders to sync, so that they're not syncing everything. But if they're not syncing everything, you still want to make sure that they sync Documents, Desktop, and Pictures. But the best way to alleviate concerns about that is files on demand, and then Windows manages a lot of the storage. In particular, files on demand, the files only essentially placeholders come down to the machine, so users can see what files they have, but the actual content of those files aren't stored on those machines unless those files are accessed. Let's see. Any other questions?
Looks like we might be done for questions then.
Okay, great.
We've got Leander saying a good session. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Yes, and yeah, thank you very much. It was very comprehensive.
Yes.
We'll get the recording this up onto the YouTube channel pretty quick. So if anyone missed it or jumped in late, wants to refresh, we'll put the link up on the community page.
Wonderful.
Awesome.
Well, all right. Thank everyone who came. And if there's any OneDrive questions that people still have, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn.
Awesome. I really appreciate your time, Michael. Thank you very much. It was very informative.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Just double check there's no other questions. I'll just stop the recording.